Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the grim, dangerous and far from glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who slip through castle halls and dark alleys, changing history with a blade and a whisper. Hollywood often makes them look stylish and cool, but the reality was that being a medieval assassin was a harsh, miserable existence. Before we get started, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy the content. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always interesting to see who joins us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story. Let's be clear, nobody in medieval times woke up thinking, "I want to stab a nobleman for a few silver coins and hide in a barrel for days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a chosen career. It was more like the final stop when life had gone completely wrong. Most medieval assassins were not mysterious lone warriors trained in secret mountain temples. They were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, skilled thieves, or people so unnoticed by society that they could kill someone and not even show up in the census. If you were wealthy, you didn't become an assassin, you hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a goat, you were in management. But if you had just escaped prison, had a reputation for solving problems quietly, and could slip into a tavern unnoticed, congratulations, someone was about to slide a purse of coins your way, and a name to eliminate. And that name wasn't someone boring like Bob the turnip farmer. Usually it was a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or a heavily guarded noble. The pay was tempting, but the job was terrifying. By the time someone considered it, they usually had nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and certainly no health care. Also, forget about job perks. No pension, no glory, no time off. You couldn't just advertise your services with a sign saying quiet eliminations by appointment. You had to stay silent, move fast, and never ever tell anyone what you did, especially not loudly over ale in the inn. Oh yeah, I'm a traveling carpet seller. The stains? Never mind. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They ended up there because the world had chewed them up and spat them out, wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. You weren't a hero or a villain. You were a nervous footnote who probably didn't live long enough to enjoy your earnings. Let's bust the first myth wide open. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in secret monasteries with wise mentors and inspirational flute music. There was no training montage, no teacher, no pep talk. If you learned anything, it was by not dying in the first few attempts. Most assassins weren't professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the ability to climb quietly without sneezing. Military experience helped, sure. That meant you knew how to hold a knife. But if not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive. Escaping afterward with your kidneys intact? That took skill, or just plain luck. Usually luck. There were no manuals, no guild meetings, no safety briefings. No one taught you how to spot a body double or where nobles kept their bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill, hoping you hadn't crept into the servants' quarters again. Poison. That was trial and error, with a heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got dizzy and suspicious of his soup. Sometimes you drank the wrong cup yourself. No medieval poison control hotline. Just herbal guesswork and a strong stomach. If you were lucky, maybe you learned some tricks from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe an older assassin showed you how to move silently on cobblestones. But mentorship was rare and short-lived because assassins didn't retire. They disappeared. Weapons training, forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger stolen from a guard, maybe a garrote if you felt fancy, and whatever else you could. Hid under your cloak without making noise. So no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a person with calloused hands, quiet footsteps, and a dangerous relationship with alleyways. Success didn't come from training, it came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, clumsily, then vanishing before anyone. Could draw your face and post it on a church door. Your education was brutal, practical, and had no graduation ceremony, only bruises, bloodstains, and the harsh realization that you were on your own. Now, why did people become assassins in the first place? The answer: money. Cold, heavy, jingling coins. The promise of pay is what got you into this. But the reality? You were paid in lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term partnership. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally no witnesses, including you. They'd offer a pouch of silver, half up front, half after the job's done, if they were feeling generous. But when the job's done, usually meant after. They verified you didn't mess up, didn't expose them, or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So you do the job. Sneak through shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a baron in his sleep. Not glamorous or poetic, and when you return, often the client had fled. Terribly sorry. Or worse, they tried to kill you because a knife to the gut was cheaper than a bonus. Even when you got paid, it was never enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood, not for the days spent hiding in haystacks full of fleas and regret. You'd get a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a reminder. You were never there. Some contracts were political traps. You might be told to kill someone dangerous, only to find it was a decoy surrounded by guards. Congratulations, you just walked into a sting operation with your execution date already set. And even if the contract was real, you couldn't sue for breach of contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the exhibit, so you learned to demand payment up front and trust no one, not even the greasy little scribe who promised this job would change your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and disappearing before they broke you. So you took the job, got lied to about the pay, and were probably going to die. Now let's talk about gear. Forget fantasy novels and sneaky video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or foldable crossbows. Your tools were whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without clinking. If you were lucky, you found a decent dagger. Not ornate or curved like a dragon's tooth, just sharp and hopefully rust-free. Poison. It existed, but it wasn't glamorous. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable mixtures of plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some acted fast, others took hours. Some caused days of vomiting before the victim recovered, angrier and more suspicious of stew. Ropes were occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or tie someone up, but only if you knew what you were doing, because fumbling knots could ruin the whole job. Bows, effective if you had one, knew how to shoot it and weren't trying to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were up close and personal. There was no time for elegant marksmanship, just quick, quiet strikes that hopefully weren't too messy. You didn't get backups. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, you improvised, maybe a slate tile, a rusty nail, or a shoe buckle. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or even inside hollowed-out bread if needed. You kept them close, not for safety, but because your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. No upgrades, no tinkering between missions, no polishing your kit. You just prayed it wouldn't betray you mid-strike. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the killing. It was you, poorly equipped and expected to work miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in back alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candlemaker. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes royalty. And those people were very hard to kill. First, the guards. Not just one or two, but dozens, armed, armored, well-fed. Some at the front, some at the back, some just standing there daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days memorizing patrol routes, door creaks, and exactly how many stairs it took before the night guard with asthma needed a break. Second, walls. Castles didn't have front porches. They had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats full of biting creatures. If you didn't fall in the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job included the risk of getting flamed just for peeking. Third, servants and staff, cooks, scribes, stable boys. One suspicious glance, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't just fighting swords, they fought gossip. And medieval gossip spread fast if it meant someone could keep their head. Finally, your actual target was paranoid. Rightfully so. Surrounded by backstabbers, relatives eyeing their titles, and dozens pretending to like them, these targets didn't eat without a tester, didn't sleep without multiple locks. Some even used decoy beds or rotated rooms like a deadly version of musical chairs. Don't get excited if you hear they're attending a feast. Sure, they'll be drunk. But so will you. You still have to get past royal guards, dogs, an alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankards. Getting close to your target could take weeks, posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, hiding. In barrels, and when the moment finally came, you had one shot, one perfect, silent, clean escape. Fail, and you'd become a public warning hanging from the castle gate with a sign saying, "Nice try." Let's be honest, when you picture a medieval assassin, you probably imagine sleek black robes, leather braces, maybe a mysterious hood billowing in moonlight. The reality? You looked like a sick goat herder with something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high fashion. In medieval times, an assassin's gear was far from high-tech. There were no custom cloaks or retractable armor, just whatever. You could scavenge worn-out peasant rags, an oversized monk's robe, or scraps of a guard's uniform that still smelled faintly of its former owner. The aim was simple: blend in. But blending in meant looking like everyone else. People who hadn't bathed in weeks, limping from old wounds, twitching from hunger. Your cloak didn't make you suspicious. Your constant belt adjustments to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth did. Forget masks. There were no stylish face coverings. Most just made you look like a leper. Great for avoiding conversations, terrible for sneaking into noble parties. If questioned, you had to improvise quickly. "I'm Brother Tobias. I handle silent prayers and rooftop maintenance." Even if you slipped past the guards, noble households weren't clueless. Servants noticed strangers, especially those fumbling chamber pots or clueless about the cook's cat. You were always new here, moments away from a candlestick. Blow. If your disguise did work, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours, pretending not to notice all the very dangerous people walking by. Wigs. Forget it. To look older or younger, you smeared dirt on your face, squinted, and hoped no one got close enough to see the beard glued on with honey. The harsh truth. Your disguise didn't protect you. It bought you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to disappear or be incredibly convincing, and if anyone saw through you, well, no one wanted to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, dressed as a nun and holding a sword, especially on feast day. Being a medieval assassin was a lonely job. There was no team, no sidekick with a crossbow, no secret lair with an alchemist, no handler sending coded scrolls and warm encouragement, just you, a rusty dagger, and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds you could count on, and whispers of assassin brotherhoods were mostly tavern gossip fueled by boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than a fellow professional killer interested in networking. Why the isolation? Because in this business, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you survived. Every contact was a risk. Every loose tongue could become a noose. Even your client might not know your real name, and if they did, you were already planning your exit. Companionship, laughable. Friends asked too many questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under your pillow. Settling down was impossible. You couldn't afford to. One mistake, one person recognizing you in a crowded market, and your life became a desperate run for the nearest sewer grate. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable, but you were the one who made people disappear. They either feared you or saw you as a liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose job might draw a mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your work, people assumed you were lying or dangerous, and they were right. So you kept your secrets, your scars and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes always on the door. You never drank too much, never stayed more than a night. You didn't share your name unless you were paid first, and even then, it was probably a fake. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of disappearing, not just in a crowd, but from every life you never had. Suppose you took the job, planned your route, bribed the doorman, disguised yourself as a convincing chimney sweep, and then froze. Maybe the target turned suddenly. Maybe they were with a child. Maybe your hands trembled like a frightened squirrel. Guess what? You were dead. Failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a slap on the wrist or a poor performance review. It meant a brutal, public, and often theatrical death involving ropes, fire, wheels, or cruel devices with names like the Bone Crackers. Delight. Missing the kill meant blowing the entire operation. Your target lived to tell everyone someone tried to murder them. You were no longer a shadow. You were a wanted man, with descriptions and crude sketches posted in every tavern. For miles, the guards you once sneaked past were now hunting you, highly motivated. Sometimes the biggest threat wasn't even your target, but your client. Fail, and you were no longer an asset. You were a liability, someone who could be tortured or killed. The very people who hired you might be the first to place a contract on your head, and there were no second chances. No, sorry, the blade slipped. Try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one moment, and if you failed, the best outcome was a quick death before anyone found out who hired you. Failure also brought shame. The silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to kill, you failed to be invisible, to be perfect. For assassins, perfection was survival. Anything less might as well paint a target on your back. No matter how many jobs you'd done before, no one cared about your previous successes. In this profession, you were only as good as your last kill, and if it didn't happen, you better run. So you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck. True. No screams, no guards, just a clean drop to the floor, and a very important person no longer breathing. Congratulations. Now run. Being a successful assassin wasn't about sipping wine on rooftops as the city burned behind you. It meant fleeing through dark alleys, blood on your boots, with dogs already on your trail. There was no victory lap, no post-job drink with colleagues, no casual debrief with your client. No time to admire your work. The moment your blade struck, your new job became escaping everyone who wanted to kill you. Doors locked, guards patrolling, horses tied up on the far side of town. You were probably bleeding. You had to plan your exit before the kill. Routes, disguises, fallback safe houses, maybe a boatman who owed you a favor or at least didn't ask questions. Because within minutes, the city would go into lockdown. Gates closed, armed checkpoints, a dozen angry men with swords, all carrying your sketch, and the warning, maybe armed and extremely stabby. And the client? If they planned to pay you, they wouldn't meet you in a cozy tavern with a smile. They would vanish too. An assassin who just finished a job was the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much and proved you could get in places others couldn't. So even with the coin in your hand, you carried a giant target on your back. What did you win? A week of sleeping in hovels, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, pretending to be Brother Lucian as you blended with monks heading east. Success didn't mean survival. It meant starting the game over in a new city, under a new name, with even more enemies hunting you. If being a medieval assassin wasn't miserable enough, constantly hunted, sleeping in places smelling like a goat, you also had to face the paranoia of those around you. To the average peasant, assassins weren't just killers, they were cursed beings. People thought you whispered to demons, smeared frog guts on your blade under full moons. Why else could you sneak past guards and vanish in the dark? Logic wasn't common then, but superstition was everywhere. Some believed assassins could shapeshift. Others claimed you were invisible, unless bathed in holy water. One tale said assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Walking through a village, you might hear a woman mutter, "Don't make eye contact. He might hex the baby." Even your tools were suspect. Carrying a dagger meant it was forged in a cursed forge. Using poison wasn't chemistry. It was witchcraft, stirred with a severed toe under a blood moon. You might think this fear worked to your advantage. After all, people avoided you. But reality was worse. Superstitious mobs didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They threw stones, lit fires, and shouted, "Burn him before he calls lightning." Your reputation made people overreact. If someone died unexpectedly, illness, accident, choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, "Maybe it was the Shadow Man, maybe him." You could be hunted just for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. That meant you had to keep moving, stay too long, and suddenly a priest would ring a bell while angry farmers armed with pitchforks awaited their moment. Heaven help you if you were caught with anything unusual. Dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That was enough for someone to shout "sorcerer" and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, clever, or fast made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die quickly, and preferably in flames. Now poison, often called the assassin's weapon of elegance, offered a quiet kill. No mess, no screams, no steel on bone, just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. That was the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the middle ages was like trying to win a bar fight armed with herbal tea and a bad attitude. Poisons were unreliable. There was no purified cyanide or labeled pills. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe a toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray. Dosing was guesswork, a pinch too little, and the noble vomited and cancelled dinner. Too much, and you died. From exposure before the first course, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just slip nightshade into the soup. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in unnoticed, or worst of all, try to poison a meal tested by 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. If your victim was noble, meals were treated like military operations, tasted, blessed, sniffed by everyone, from steward to jester. By the time the food reached the plate, it had passed more security than a royal wedding. Assuming you slipped the poison unnoticed and your target actually ate it, what happened next was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some days. One moment your mark laughed at a joke, the next he clutched his stomach, demanding to, if you survived poisoning attempts, guess who took the blame? Not the cook, not the taster. It was you, the quiet man with knowledge of herbs and nervous eyes. Poisoning was a risky, slow method, filled with unpredictable factors, none of which worked in your favor. And if you were caught, death wouldn't come quickly. You'd face brutal interrogation with torture until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the duke down to the dog. You might think that successfully changing history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal line, or silencing a political enemy would earn you recognition. But no, you were an assassin, which meant your name was never meant to be known. At best, you became a rumor. Some hooded stranger, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man who never finished his ale. You might have carried out the most legendary killing of the century and still ended up listed as a mysterious death in the official records. In fact, that was the goal. Your client wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer they were, and less likely to be poisoned by their own assassin later. So your name was erased the moment the job was done. If you even used your real name, you never signed your work. No bragging, no trophies, no presents beyond the instant of the kill. And if anyone did know your identity, that was a dangerous loose end. In your line of work, loose ends didn't last. Long honor, forget about it. There were no medals for silence, no statues for the one who ended a war with a dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a monument, they commissioned it themselves. You got a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or, if things went badly, a head. On a spike labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. A whispered warning, don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich, and the man who carried out the deed, gone like a ghost. That was your legacy. Not fame, not fear, just absence. You were not supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to disappear. And if you stayed around long enough to be recognized, that was a deadly mistake. In the medieval world, heroes were remembered, assassins were erased. You survived. You completed the mission. You even got paid. A miracle. Now all you have to do is keep a low profile, keep your head down, and trust your client to honor the deal and protect your identity. Wrong. In medieval assassination, there was one rule, even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially your client. Whether a noble, merchant, or an ambitious bishop with loose morals, your client didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something terrible done, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. Once the task was done, you became a liability. You knew too much. Who wanted who dead, when, why, and how much they'd pay for it. That made you dangerous, not only to their enemies, but to them as well. So what happened? They ghosted you, denied ever meeting you, or worse, sent another assassin after you to tie off the contract with something sharper than ink. There are even cases where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to do the job and another to kill the first immediately afterward. No refunds, just reduced risk. If you dared to blackmail a client or threaten exposure, that was your final mistake. Powerful medieval figures didn't negotiate with assassins, they crushed them. If your client had an ounce of honor, rare as that was, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you had to assume they watched you from afar, with someone sharpening steel and memorizing your steps. You were the secret that couldn't speak, the shadow that couldn't stay. Success didn't earn trust because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even your employer, wanted to be next. Suppose you beat the odds. You survived the kills, the lies, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and perhaps your own morality. What then? Retirement? Absolutely not. Medieval assassins didn't retire. No farewell banquets, no quiet seaside cottages, no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into peace. You vanished, or you died. Often, both. The problem was simple. You were never safe. Even if you walked away, your past didn't. You carried too many secrets, too many names, and too much blood. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. Even if no one actively hunted you, which was unlikely, you lived with constant fear. Someone new, young, and ambitious might have just received a contract on a once-feared figure, so you changed your name. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You faked a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once worked as a guard. But even then, sleep was elusive. You avoided crowds, always sat facing the door, kept a dagger under the floorboard beside. A pouch of untouched coins, smelling of the last man who paid you. You couldn't even trust yourself. Years of silent kills and narrow escapes rewired your mind. Every knock made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. Dreams became dangerous. You couldn't love, relax, or laugh too loud. You lived as a ghost pretending to be a man. There was no endgame for a medieval assassin, just a slow, cold fade into obscurity, always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped quietly into darkness and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best outcome. By now, you've probably realized being a medieval assassin wasn't romantic, noble, or even lucrative. It was a harsh, thankless career wrapped in blood-stained cloth, followed by people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions that you'd be slick and in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be was cold, hungry, and one mistake away from the noose. You arrive in town, cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to find your target moved. The guards are drunk and trigger-happy. The stable boy you bribed just sold you out for ale and bread. You freeze at the wrong moment, stab the wrong person, get spotted by a maid who once saw your face near the chapel. Suddenly, you're not a shadow. You're the problem. Then you run. But you're not used to medieval terrain, mud, uneven cobblestones, and an absurd number of loose chickens in the street. You slip, fall, get tackled by Thomas, the guard who just got dumped and needs an outlet. Suppose you survive that. Then comes the aftermath. No allies, no honor, no future. Just whispers, suspicion, and the painful realization that even if you succeed, the best you'll get is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village still believing in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And honestly, you shouldn't try. The assassin's life was not glamorous. It was a cruel machine that consumed people and spat out shadows. It offered power without peace and purpose without place. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting at the end was silence. A silence no one questioned because no one even remembered you were there. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known as Myrtle, a princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself. Whether or not heroic blood truly ran in her veins, one fact is clear. This was not a woman born to stand on the sidelines of history. From childhood, Myrtle was immersed in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing wasn't just political. It was shaped by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and deep reverence for the ancient gods. She wasn't the type of princess to smile and embroider tapestries. She was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot under the moon and entered trance-like states calling on the divine. Her connection to the gods wasn't just performance. It was personal. She didn't simply worship. She embodied the divine, ancient sources, likely penned by men both terrified and fascinated. Claim she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, allowing them to coil beside her in bed. Whether literal truth or the kind of slander powerful women attract, the image stuck. To her allies, this made her divine. To her enemies, dangerous. Her true power began not in battlefields or throne rooms, but in flickering torchlight, among whispered secrets of priestesses and the curling bodies of serpents. She was more than a princess. She was a living oracle, touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously lustful, arrived at Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess. He met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't simply political. It was a collision of prophecy and power. From the start, omens surrounded them. Some said lightning struck on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it became legend. One thing is certain. The union of Olympias and Philip didn't just create a child, it created Alexander the Great. And Olympias intended to shape his destiny, from his very first breath. Their marriage was far from a fairy tale. From the beginning, it was a volatile mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, ruthless and charismatic, collected wives like trophies. Olympias was likely a teenager when they married around 357 BCE, but far from naive. She saw Philip as a man whose ambition matched her own, a possible divine counterpart for her spiritual path. Macedon was a hard kingdom, a land of iron and ambition, where kings were murdered by relatives and brothers, turned rivals overnight. But Olympias, priestess of Epirus, entered with her head held high, her eyes fixed on the crown. Their marriage was turbulent. Philip, for all his brilliance, was not built for monogamy. He married several women, always for alliances, always for power. Olympias didn't sit quietly in the shadows. She held her own court, maintained alliances, and consulted oracles and rites to divine her future, and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came the birth of Alexander, wrapped in celestial drama. Legends say Olympias dreamed a thunderbolt struck her. Womb and flames danced around her child without harm. Philip reportedly envisioned sealing his wife's womb with a lion, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or created them, they acted as if Alexander was destined not only to rule a kingdom, but the world. But as the child was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married late in life. This was more than a domestic rivalry. It was a threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be seen as purer by the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's future. Olympias understood this clearly. The palace wasn't home, it was a battlefield. She would use every snake, dream, ritual, and whisper she had to ensure her son was not only remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtle, she was Olympias, and no one would take her son's throne without facing her wrath. By Alexander's teenage years, the Macedonian palace at Pella was a war zone of subtle insults, political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympias wasn't just fighting for influence. She was fighting for survival. She knew the court was filled with snakes, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip II began to distance himself from her, campaigning more, drinking more, and perhaps the most damaging of all was listening more closely to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when Philip married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's top generals. To Olympias, this was more than betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The marriage ceremony itself ended in disaster. During the feast, Attalus, drunk, openly mocked Olympias and Alexander, questioning the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he truly Philip's son? Or was he, as Olympias claimed, the child of a god? What was intended as an insult became Olympias's advantage. Let them whisper, let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast, and Olympias left Macedon altogether, retreating to Epirus. But her departure was no sign of defeat. It was a calculated strategy. In her homeland, she still held royal status. She could gather support, influence key figures, quietly, and watch as Philip's court began to crumble from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be a threat. Then came a shock that rocked the kingdom. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he prepared to invade Persia and crown himself not only king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question that haunted every corridor and torchlit hall was simple. Who was responsible? Was it Pausanias, the disgruntled bodyguard, a result of court intrigue, Alexander himself, or, whispered in fear, Was it Olympias? No one could prove it, and no one dared speak openly, but many believed it. Within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead, reportedly murdered by Olympias herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon in mourning and confusion, Olympias seized the moment. While others scrambled to make sense of the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, and decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympias didn't just have her killed, she made her death a public humiliation. Some say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter. Others claim Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What is agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many royal mothers refused to accept. In the palace, mercy was weakness. A rival child, no matter how small, was a future threat. Olympias was done defending. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, she could focus on securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold and brilliant and trained by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But don't be mistaken, Alexander's rise wasn't only due to his charisma or his father's legacy. It was Olympias who knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting her son's ascension, she was orchestrating it. Alexander reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family, but he did not stop it because, deep down, he knew what Olympias always understood: power requires blood. In Macedon, bloodlines were both blessing and curse. With her son crowned, Olympias began to step back from public life, but this was no retreat. She shifted from open confrontation to quiet influence. As Alexander prepared to conquer Persia, she stayed behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. Alexander's mission wasn't just military, it was divine. He wasn't going to war, he was fulfilling prophecy. As long as Olympias lived, no rival, Macedonian or Persian, would stop that plan. She had crowned her son, cleansed the palace, and now guarded his empire from behind the scenes, teeth bared. As Alexander marched east to conquer the world, Olympias remained in Macedon. Officially Queen Mother, she ruled in all but name. Though regency was given to Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote to her son constantly, advising, warning, and sometimes chastising. These were not the gentle letters of a doting mother, but political briefings, filled with prophecy and sharp criticism. Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every word. She reminded him of his true enemies, questioned the loyalty of his companions, criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his marriages, and his flirtation with godhood. No one else dared to speak so frankly, but Olympias was fearless, both as mother and priestess of divine will. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew resentful. Olympias undermined him at every turn, using her status, religious authority, and family ties to stir opposition. Her influence spread across Epirus, Thessaly, and the aristocracy. Rumors she planted spread quickly, and with Olympias, a whisper could be deadlier than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander grew more urgent. She warned him that Antipater was ambitious, portraying him as a second Philip, ready to betray and usurp the throne. Whether she truly believed this or simply feared losing power, she pressed her son to act. Alexander hesitated. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he fought in Asia, so the tension between mother and general deepened. Olympias watched and waited, growing impatient beneath her religious robes and maternal concern. She hadn't survived palace wars to be ruled by an aging soldier. As Alexander's empire stretched from Asia to India, Olympias saw cracks forming. He was overextended, trusting too many foreign advisors, drifting away from the mother and the gods who had made him. She believed his victories came from divine favor and from her. And if he forgot that, Olympias knew how to remind kings of their true nature, even when that king was her own son. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it came not like a trumpet, but like a dagger. For Olympias, it was more than losing a son. It was the collapse of the world she had built over decades. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied and unleashed, was gone. He left no clear heir, only chaos. His vast empire already fractured. Generals, his so-called successors, divided the spoils like jackals over a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he despised Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals hoping to claim the throne through her bloodline. Olympias saw the inevitable. Civil war. She would have to act again. But now, without Alexander, what she had was his bloodline, his young son Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess. Alexander had married Roxana, but both were vulnerable in Macedon. Olympias knew the infant was the last real link to her son's legacy, making him both target and weapon. She allied with Roxana and the boy, determined to protect them and use the child's birthright to stake her claim in the political battle. But the tide was turning. Generals who once bowed to Alexander had no intention of submitting to his widow or mother. They had armies, ambition, and grudges. Olympias did not flinch. She had faced snakes, traitors, and kings. Few warlords with crowns and stolen spears could intimidate her. She plotted and waited. Antipater died, replaced by his son, Cassander, a cold man with no patience for Olympia's games. It was only a matter of time before these forces clashed, the serpent mother of Alexander and the icy user who sought to bury her. Though Alexander was gone, his shadow still moved, and Olympias was still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years after Alexander's death, as his empire fell into civil war, Olympias made her boldest move yet. She returned to Macedon not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. Regency had splintered, Cassander seized power, and Roxana and young Alexander IV were effectively imprisoned. Olympias saw the danger. If she didn't act, her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. She struck a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general who still held some legitimate authority. Olympias would return not to plead, but to rule. With Polyperchon's backing, she entered Macedon at the head of an army. From the moment her feet touched home soil, everything changed. Towns opened gates, soldiers defected, and even old enemies hesitated. Despite her age, Olympias was still a name that shook the ground. Then came her revenge. One by one, she hunted down Cassander's loyalists. When she captured Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife Eurydice was given the chance to kill herself. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was brutality masked as royal protocol. Olympias staged the event like a goddess delivering justice. Her message was unmistakable. Only Alexander's bloodline had the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief, intense moment, Olympias held the kingdom. She restored the dynasty, avenged betrayals, and reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire in dry grass, and Cassander remained. He returned with vengeance. His army outnumbered hers, his resources were greater, his cruelty colder. Her allies began to abandon her, and Polyperchon lost influence. The tide turned. Olympias, isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match, Macedon burned, and now smoke thickened at her gates. Once the most feared woman in the ancient world, Olympias was besieged alone in the coastal fortress. But she did not plead or beg. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food dwindled, disease spread, allies vanished. Yet inside the fortress, she maintained the unshakable presence that once shook kings. To the end, she carried herself not as prisoner, but as mother of a god. Cassander, cautious, hesitated to kill Olympias outright. He knew killing her was dangerous. She carried a myth-like armor. She was still Alexander's mother. To kill her might seem blasphemy. Instead, he offered her safety, surrender, and live. Olympias knew better. She had seen too many royal promises broken. Hunger was no longer discomfort, but death. Her garrison broke, her followers surrendered, and finally Olympias, unbending until the end, was handed to her enemies. Cassander did not kill her himself. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he gave her to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power, letting them decide her fate. They condemned her to death, but when the executioners came, none dared strike first. Olympias stood tall and silent, eyes fixed on them like an oracle gazing through smoke. These were Macedonians who had grown up hearing of her rituals, visions, and snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. Now a frail old woman cloaked in myth faced them, and no one had the courage to swing the sword. So Cassander sent outsiders, foreigners with no memory of her power, only orders to obey. And thus Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony or dignity, but in silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline, holding any real power, and with it the final ember of a dynasty. An empire born from divine ambition was extinguished. Yet even in death, Olympus left a lasting shadow, and history never forgot the Serpent Queen. Olympus did not die on a throne. She perished in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once ruled. History, however, is unpredictable. It does not always favor those who die in luxury. Sometimes it remembers those who fall with a hiss. Olympus was never destined for a quiet legacy. In life, she wielded motherhood as a weapon and prophecy as her shield. She was more than just Alexander the Great's mother. She was one of the key forces behind his rise. Without her, the myth of the divine child would not exist, nor the rituals speaking of thunderbolts and lions. Nor would there have been the ruthless elimination of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to control the known world. Olympus didn't merely give birth to an empire. She fiercely defended it. Among the ancient world's most ruthless rulers, Olympia stands apart. She didn't lead armies on the battlefield like Cleopatra or charge into combat like Boudica. Her battlefield was more subtle and colder, a world of poison, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear, but, even more importantly, she grasped the power of belief. She convinced people her son was divine, and perhaps she believed it herself. Her enemies labeled her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they were not mistaken. Olympia embodied all these traits and more. She was a product of a harsh world that valued cunning over kindness. From early on, she learned that mercy was a luxury no queen could afford. Over the centuries, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some saw her as a villain, others as a visionary. Yet no historian, ancient or modern, could call her irrelevant. She haunted Alexander's legacy like a ghost, always present, lurking just behind the curtain. Perhaps that was where she truly belonged, not as a tragic mother or a mere footnote in a king's story, but as a story in her own right, a woman wrapped in prophecy who slept beside snakes and outlived gods. Olympia's bones have long since turned to dust, but her legend lives on in every tale of ruthless queens, every whisper of destiny marked by blood, every empire built on myth. She remains coiled in the shadows, waiting. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, just south of modern Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more dream than reality. Stone corridors twist in every direction, rooms fold back on themselves, staircases lead nowhere. Even today, it's easy to lose your way. This place is Knossos, the heart of Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of history's most famous myths, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. Before legend, there was a palace, unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos was more than a royal residence. It was an entire city under one roof. Covering nearly 150,000 square feet, it held over 1,000 rooms, light wells, storage areas, shrines, workshops, and possibly the first flushing toilets in history. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and a sophisticated air circulation system. This was not a primitive fortress. It was an architectural masterpiece. To modern archaeologists, Knossos looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably seemed magical. The man who introduced Knossos to the modern world was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans excavated the site and quickly became convinced it was the source of the Greek labyrinth myth. The confusing layout, symbolic architecture, and countless bull motifs painted on walls, carved into stone, and crafted into tiny golden charms pointed to this conclusion. The bull was sacred to the Minoans. Evans even named the civilization after the legendary King Minos. Whether Minos was real or myth, his story became inseparable from the ruins. But here's the twist. No one has found a literal labyrinth. No underground maze, no prison chambers, no half-man monster. Instead, we have something far more mysterious. A city built in loops, wings, and layers, deliberately designed to be confusing. The deeper you explore, the more the line between history and myth blurs. So was the Minotaur born from these walls, or was the palace itself the monster? Knossos may not reveal its secrets easily, but it asks the right questions. The myth is well known, a monstrous half-man, half-bull creature trapped in a labyrinth so complex that no one who entered ever escaped, except Theseus, the Athenian hero. He killed the beast and escaped using a ball of thread and the cleverness of Princess Ariadne. But where did this story originate, and why a labyrinth? Early versions speak of King Minos, the powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded tribute from Athens. 7 boys and 7 girls each year sacrificed to the Minotaur, a creature born from divine punishment and shame. The Minotaur, locked in an underground maze, symbolized the dark side of power, something savage hidden beneath grandeur. To the ancient Greeks, Crete was a land of wealth, mystery, and fear. The Minoan people were seen as elegant yet alien. Their rituals involved bulls, their art depicted strange gods, and their palaces were unlike anything on the mainland. For a Greek visitor around 1000 BCE, Knossos might have felt like another world. The bull was sacred in Minoan culture. Frescoes show young men and women vaulting over charging bulls in ritual displays. Stylized bull horns, known as horns of consecration, appear on rooftops and altars. Combined with a palace that resembled a maze, the ingredients for legend were set. But what if the Minotaur wasn't just a monster? Some scholars argue the story reflects a memory of Cretan dominance over Athens, a time when Athens truly paid tribute to a stronger foreign power. The labyrinth might symbolize political entrapment, the Minotaur, the terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Others see a psychological reading, the labyrinth as the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as hidden urges, and Theseus as the hero walking bravely into darkness, guided by the thread of memory. Regardless, the myth remains tangled with Knossos. The palace is the closest thing to a real labyrinth we've found. No monster, no Ariadne, but something deeper. Not just a myth echoing through history, but a history waiting to become myth. Long before Athens built its marble temples or Sparta sharpened its spears, the Minoan civilization thrived as one of Europe's earliest advanced societies. They ruled, not by conquest, but through trade, art, and an almost supernatural mastery of architecture. At the heart of their power was Knossos, a palace that was more than royalty's seat. It was a cultural, ritual, and economic center. The Minoans flourished from roughly 2600 to 1400 BCE. Based on Crete, they developed a sprawling trade network reaching Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. There, ships sliced through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, transporting pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury goods. They didn't build vast armies, they built relationships. And that, more than weapons, made them wealthy. Minoan culture was strikingly different from their later Greek successors. Their art celebrated nature, animals, and flowing human movement, not war or divine punishment. Frescoes depict dancers, dolphins, and athletes vaulting over bulls. Their goddesses were powerful, often bare-breasted figures holding snakes, symbols of fertility, transformation, and protection. At the center was Knossos, not a fortress on a hill, but a sprawling complex in a fertile valley. It had no massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt secure or projected enough power to make defense unnecessary. Their confidence showed in architecture, multi-story buildings, colonnaded courtyards, and advanced plumbing systems, hinted at a society far ahead of its time. Yet despite their sophistication, the Minoans left no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, remains unreadable. We don't know what they called themselves, what their kings believed, or what prayers they offered. All that remains are ruins, art and influence absorbed by later civilizations and echoed in Greek myths. The Minoans were not just palace builders, they were architects of mystery. Knossos was not merely a building, it was the heart of a civilization that shimmered briefly like sunlight on the Aegean before vanishing. Some say their echo still wanders the maze. Walking through Knossos is like walking through layered, confusing, beautiful time. It's not just the scale that overwhelms, it's the design. Rooms lead to more rooms, corridors split and disappear, light wells pierce the building's heart, and stairs spiral into shadows or open suddenly into sunlit courtyards. Nothing follows a straight path. It's easy to see why ancient visitors whispered labyrinth. Knossos was not just a palace, it was a living organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet, it contained over 1,000 chambers, some tiny, some grand. These weren't random rooms, but carefully built workshops, storage spaces, shrines, apartments, and throne rooms arranged around a large central courtyard that may have hosted public ceremonies or bull-leaping rituals, built on multiple levels. Sometimes 4 or 5 stories tall, Knossos used natural slopes and artificial terraces. Navigating it without getting lost would require memory, instinct, or a thread like Theseus's, yet beneath the seeming chaos lies remarkable intelligence. The Minoans mastered passive ventilation, cooling rooms through air shafts and open stairwells. They funneled rainwater through clay pipes and had flushing toilets centuries before Rome. One iconic area is the so-called throne room, named after the alabaster chair built into a wall, flanked by benches. Surrounding it are frescoes of griffins, mythical guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's chamber, or a sacred court? No one knows for certain. The walls speak in color, vibrant frescoes showing dolphins swimming above bathtubs, women in elegant skirts with bare chests, and youths leaping over bulls midair. The art was more than decoration, it was identity, fluid, natural, deeply connected to earth and sea. Yet the deeper you explore, the more Knossos disorients. Some parts seem intentionally complex, as if designed to confuse. Perhaps this is the root of the labyrinth legend, not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive, a place inspiring awe, ritual, and a hint of fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts, just a building meant to make you question where you are and what lies. Around the next corner, Knossos was not just an administrative center or royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan spirit steeped in ritual, myth, and divine mystery. Unlike later Greek temples, there were no towering columns to Zeus or marble shrines to Athena. Instead, the spiritual world of Knossos was subtle, woven into the building's very fabric. Shrines hid in corners, pillars rose like sacred sentinels, and stylized bull horns adorned rooftops and altars. Everywhere the bull motif dominated, suggesting a strong connection. Between worship, nature, and this revered animal, the Minoans did not fear the bull, they celebrated it. The famous bull-leaping fresco in Knossos isn't just athletic art, it may represent a religious rite. Young men and women vaulting over charging bulls engaged in a dangerous dance of grace. It was no mere sport, it was sacred theater, perhaps an offering to the gods or a symbolic triumph over chaos. Then there are the snake goddesses, discovered in storerooms beneath the palace. These figurines are among the most iconic Minoan artifacts, bare-breasted, arms raised with serpents coiled. In their hands or around their bodies, these figures radiate power. They are not submissive idols, but symbols of strength and mystery. They were guardians of household fertility and perhaps life itself. To the Minoans, snakes symbolized renewal, rebirth, and mystery. Creatures connected both to the earth and the underworld. The rooms where these objects appeared suggest the presence of household shrines or ritual spaces, quiet, sacred corners tucked away within the palace's busy heart. Alongside frescoes, horns, altars, and labyrinthine corridors, the entire complex begins to resemble a ritual machine, a structure designed not merely for living, but for connecting with the divine. Knossos had no centralized temple, because the palace itself functioned as one. Its layout, art, and design reflected a spiritual worldview where the boundary between sacred and everyday life did not exist. This was a place where myth was architecture, corridors served as passages to the gods, and every echo in stone chambers could have been a whispered prayer. Knossos was more than a residence, it was a home for gods. For centuries, Knossos stood as a symbol of prosperity, innovation, and cultural refinement. Then something happened, something abrupt and mysterious. By around 1400 BCE, the palace was abandoned, frescoes faded, and the Minoan civilization that once dominated the seas vanished like mist over the Aegean. What caused this? Theories vary. Some focus on natural disaster. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in one of history's largest explosions. The blast triggered tsunamis that battered Crete's northern coast, devastating ports and farmland. Ash clouds likely blocked sunlight, damaging crops and altering the climate. Although Knossos wasn't destroyed immediately, the eruption's aftermath may have deeply shaken the island's economic, political, and spiritual foundations. Others suggest war played a role. By 1450 BCE, the rising power of the Mycenaeans, mainland, Greeks might have exploited Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence shows Knossos was briefly reoccupied, but the culture had changed. art shifted toward martial themes, and Linear A, the Minoan script, gave way to Linear B, used by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and bull dancers now spoke in a foreign language. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't conquer Nos in a single invasion, but gradually absorbed it, first through trade, then influence, and finally rule. Others argue internal collapse, political instability, civil unrest, or elite failure was just as significant. What is striking, however, is the lack of evidence for large-scale violence. No burnt skeletons or signs of mass slaughter appear in the ruins. Nos didn't fall with a roar, it fell quietly. The grand palace system simply ceased. The rooms went silent. Rituals stopped. Nature slowly reclaimed the space. By the time Homer wrote his epics, Nos was already ancient myth, a memory woven into stories of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. Perhaps fittingly, what destroyed Nos was not only eruption or invasion, but time itself, how even the greatest achievements eventually fade under the weight of new empires. Yet, the ruins remain. If you listen carefully, the maze beneath still hums. For thousands of years, Nos lay buried beneath Cretan soil, just another forgotten mound, its name lost, myths distorted, walls swallowed by olive groves and dust. That changed when one man pursued a legend. Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for drama and a passion for Homeric myth, purchased the land covering the ruins in 1900. Local farmers had uncovered strange seals and artifacts, hinting at something vast beneath their feet. Evans's excavations transformed our understanding of the Aegean. He uncovered a palace so vast, complex, and advanced that he believed it to be the mythical home of King Minos. The frescoes, horns, and unique architecture all suggested to him the labyrinth itself. Evans was more than an archaeologist. He was a storyteller, sometimes controversial. He named the builders Minoans, after Minos, and interpreted symbols, reconstructed frescoes, and restored parts of the palace using reinforced concrete, a method that has sparked both admiration and criticism. What stands today at Nos is part ancient ruin, part early 20th century imagination. Still, Evans did what no one else dared. He resurrected Nos. He offered Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age civilization far older than classical Greece, a world of art, mystery, and maritime elegance. He also uncovered the undeciphered Linear A script, opening new questions about language, literacy, and our historical limits. But Evans did more than unearth stone. He revived a myth. Behind the legend of the labyrinth was something real, complex, and profoundly human, a palace that felt like a maze, a civilization that slipped into shadow, and a man who peeled back the earth to reveal a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had imagined. Nos had slept for 3,000 years until Evans awakened it. Walking through Nos today is not merely a stroll through architecture, but an encounter with the language of symbols, frescoes, carvings, and patterns everywhere. However, the Minoans left no Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. Instead of reading their thoughts, we must interpret their art. The art of Nos is unlike any other ancient culture. There is no focus on warfare, kings, or battle-hardened heroes. Instead, nature bursts forth, dolphins, blooming lilies, birds in flight, and sacred bulls. Humans appear alive, elegant, often dancing or performing rituals. Even scenes hinting at danger retain rhythm and beauty. The Minoans weren't chronicling conquest. They celebrated life cycles and perhaps cosmic order. Their most iconic symbol is the double axe, or labrise, found throughout Nos, in shrines, frescoes, and etched into stone. Believed to be a religious emblem linked to female divinity or celestial, Cycles, some suggest the word labyrinth derives from lebris, meaning the labyrinth was not a maze, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Also notable are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed atop walls and altars. These likely marked sacred boundaries. Combined with frequent depictions of bulls and bull-leaping rituals, it's clear the animal held deep spiritual significance. Whether symbolizing nature, fertility, chaos, or divine presence remains debated, but the bull is everywhere. Even the palace layout might hold symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists believe it was designed not just for practical use, but to reflect celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a spiritual journey through life, death, and the underworld, a maze of meaning rather than mere imprisonment. Without a deciphered script, every theory balances. Between insight and speculation, the Minoans spoke in symbols, not stories, so we interpret what is Nos trying to tell us. We hear rhythms and see images, but their meaning remains elusive, like a thread unraveling into myth. Nos is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't feel lifeless. Walk its corridors today, and you sense something humming beneath the surface. Not ghosts or gods, but echoes of myths, lives, and questions that endure. Thousands of years after its fall, Nos continues to captivate. Tourists wander its halls, archaeologists search for answers, and storytellers spin new tales inspired by its shadow. The Minotaur is myth, but the labyrinth sensation is real. We don't know who ruled Nos. We don't know the names of its kings, queens, or priests. We don't know their prayers or laws. But we do know they loved beauty, worshipped nature, and understood balance between architecture and art, ritual and reality. And we know they were first. Before the Parthenon, before Rome, before Hebrew temples or Persian palaces, there was Nos, a palace and city, a city and temple, a temple and story. Perhaps that is what the labyrinth truly is, not a prison or puzzle, but a narrative carved in stone, a myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur did not arise from nowhere. It emerged from this place, the confusion of its corridors, the reverence of its bull rituals, and the awe it inspired in those who sought to understand it. The Greeks turned it into a story. We turned it into archaeology, but at its core, Nos has always been both. Today we explore its ruins in daylight, take photographs, draw maps, and even reconstruct frescoes. Yet the mystery persists. The line between fact and legend shimmers, like heat over stone. Perhaps Nos endures because it doesn't provide all the answers. It reminds us that history is not always meant to be solved. Sometimes it is meant to be felt. Nos, ancient, tangled, and half-remembered, is more than a location. It is a question leading us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we are still following the thread. Occasionally, unlucky soldiers knew that catapults were not merely instruments of destruction, they were also tools of spectacle. Ancient commanders used them to send powerful messages, sometimes, quite literally. Corpses were hurled over city walls to spread disease and terror, while severed heads were launched inside to crush enemy morale. In one grim instance, diseased bodies were flung into enemy territory as an early form of biological warfare. However, catapults had their limitations. They were heavy, required skilled operators, and could be rendered ineffective by difficult terrain. Yet when properly set up, they could bombard a city from a safe distance. For the first time, cities realized their thick stone walls needed to withstand more than just battering rams. They had to defend against attacks coming from above. The era of flying destruction had begun. If the catapult was clever, then the Gauche trebuchet was majestic, towering, creaking, and terrifying. It was the uncontested king of medieval siege warfare. When a trebuchet arrived on the battlefield, it was more than a weapon. It was a statement. Your walls are meaningless. Unlike tension-powered machines, trebuchets relied on gravity. A long, swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame had a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Raising the weight and releasing it caused the arm to swing, flinging the sling and its deadly cargo in a high arc over defenses. This was controlled destruction, precise, predictable, and devastating. The trebuchet's origins trace back to early traction models, used by the Chinese as early as the 4th century BCE, where manpower replaced counterweights. The counterweight trebuchet, the type that transformed siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, appeared around the 12th century, likely introduced through Byzantine or Muslim channels. Once Europe adopted the design, it spread rapidly, across castles and crusades. The power was staggering. A well-constructed trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of furniture would crash into towers, pulverize walls, or shatter enemy morale. But the real advantage was the arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles gracefully over walls, targeting courtyards, barracks, and supply depots inside the city. They hurled more than just stones, diseased animals, burning pitch, pots of lime to blind defenders, even messages or insults wrapped around rocks. One famous story from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet, so enormous that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king refused to accept this surrender, wanting instead to test the machine's might. Despite its destructive power, the trebuchet was slow, taking hours to assemble, minutes to reload, and requiring expert engineers. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, force, and psychological impact quite like it. It was a medieval hammer from the skies. When that counterweight dropped, cities held their breath, while catapults struck from a distance and battering rams shattered gates. Siege towers took a more direct approach. These wooden giants on wheels, covered in wet hides to resist fire and bristling with archers and spearmen, rolled up to city walls and delivered armed troops right onto the battlements. Siege towers were the ancient equivalent of armored personnel, carriers and mobile fortresses combined. When one rumbled toward your defenses, you knew the real battle was imminent. Siege towers weren't subtle. They were large, bold, and highly effective when used correctly. The Assyrians may have pioneered them in the 9th century BCE, but the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, pushed the design to dramatic extremes. During the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius built a 9-story tower called the Helpolis, or Taker of Cities. Over 100 feet tall, equipped with catapults, iron plating, and powered by thousands of soldiers, it ultimately collapsed under its own weight. Still, the ambition was unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls only stop those who can't get over them. Towers gave attackers elevated platforms to descend onto battlements, bypassing gates and scaling ladders. Archers on top rained arrows down, while troops below prepared to storm the walls. Yet, these towers had vulnerabilities. They were slow, susceptible to mud, and prime targets for defenders armed with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even sabotaged terrain. Defenders often dug ditches, flooded moats, or built secondary inner walls, called counterscarp defenses, to block siege towers' advances. When successful, these defenses caused chaos. A breach was bad enough, but suddenly having enemy soldiers on your ramparts was catastrophic. Siege towers changed warfare from a horizontal battle into a vertical struggle for survival. Once the gangplank dropped, hand-to-hand combat was inevitable. While rams smashed gates and trebuchets hurled stones, some of the most destructive siege tactics occurred underground. Siege tunneling, or sapping, was the grim art of collapsing walls from below. The idea was ancient and brutally effective. Dig beneath the enemy's walls, support the tunnel with wooden beams, then set the supports on fire. When the timbers, Burned, the tunnel collapsed, taking the wall's foundation with it. One moment a city stood firm, the next a huge section of wall crumbled. Tunneling lacked grandeur. There were no massive engines or dramatic launches, but it was the stealthy killer of fortress warfare. Early versions were practiced by the Assyrians, but the technique was perfected by Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the 429 BCE siege of Plataea, Spartans attempted tunneling, but defenders dug counter-tunnels, intercepting them underground. These skirmishes, fought by torchlight in claustrophobic tunnels, became known as countermining. Imagine soldiers digging hundreds of feet beneath the earth in total darkness, listening for enemy picks, racing to intercept with knives and shovels. There was no glory, only fear, suffocation, and dirt. But when undermining succeeded, the results were devastating. In 1212, during the siege of Rochester Castle in England, King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports collapsed, bringing down the tower above. The defenders were stunned and soon surrendered. By the 13th century, siege engineers were specialists, part geologists, part demolition experts, studying soil and planning collapses with terrifying accuracy. Tunneling required time, effort, and a measure of madness, but proved one thing: if you couldn't go over or through the walls, you could always bring them down from below. Not all siege drama came from attackers. Defenders had deadly tricks of their own, often fiery ones. Greek fire, developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, was a fearsome weapon, a napalm-like substance that burned even on water. Sprayed through siphons or thrown in clay pots, it caused chaos. Its exact formula remains a mystery, lost with the empire, but its impact was legendary. Entire fleets were consumed by flames in minutes. In simpler defenses, boiling liquids were standard. Boiling water, oil, or sand poured from murder holes, openings in ceilings above gateways, were common. Oil was especially feared because it clung to skin and armor, then ignited. Imagine climbing a siege ladder only to be doused in fire that couldn't be extinguished. Hot sand, while less dramatic, was cruel. It slipped into armor gaps and caused severe burns, quickly turning brave soldiers into agony. Defenders also used gravity. Giant stones, logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto siege engines or troops. The goal was to kill and to destroy machines and morale simultaneously. They also set traps, hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades, turning castles into painful puzzles designed to slow, confuse, and punish attackers. All these tactics shared one purpose: delay. Every minute a wall held was a minute closer to enemy supplies dwindling, disease spreading in camps, or reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was ultimately a battle of attrition. Attackers relied on physics and force, defenders on creativity and fierce determination. Beyond raw destruction, siege warfare was about psychological dominance, breaking the defender's will before the walls fell. Siege engines were massive, groaning, flaming symbols of doom. Every creak of a siege tower, every arcing boulder from a trebuchet was meant to remind those inside, "You are not safe." Ancient commanders understood this. The Assyrians paraded siege engines openly, dragging them across deserts with fanfare. Romans built camps visible to enemies, letting them watch battering rams being assembled and catapults tested. Siege was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes the payloads themselves carried messages. Severed heads of enemies or generals were launched over walls, often still armored. During the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded with rocks and diseased corpses to spread panic and plague. In 1346, during the Mongol siege of Kaffa, it's believed that hurling plague-infected bodies over walls contributed to outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet wasn't just a weapon, it was an announcement. Its arrival was heard long before it was seen, the creaking winches, grinding ropes, heavy thunk of the counterweight, like the heartbeat of a brewing storm. The most dangerous part was the unknown. Would the next projectile be a stone, a barrel, a fire, a shower of arrows, or just silence, heavy and ominous, as engineers adjusted their aim? Even the sounds of siege warfare were psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of battering rams, the sudden quiet before a shot, drove defenders to the edge. Commanders aimed to instill despair, convincing enemies that resistance was futile, that their gods had abandoned them and their walls were mere temporary obstacles. Often, when that mental barrier broke, gates opened without a fight. In siege warfare, minds often gave way before masonry. With the arrival of gunpowder in the late medieval period, traditional siege engines declined. Cannons revolutionized warfare. A single well-placed shot could achieve in seconds what a trebuchet took hours to do. Once impenetrable stone walls became liabilities. By the 15th century, Europe's great castles were crumbling under iron cannonballs. Still, the principles laid by ancient siege engineers endured. Modern artillery owes a debt to catapults and trebuchets. Every ballistic missile or long-range howitzer descends from the same question: how to break what's meant to be unbreakable from afar. Physics, trajectory, tension and force, these were discovered and perfected centuries before gunpowder entered the scene. Even today, military psychology's shock and awe, overwhelming firepower and visible dominance, has roots in ancient siege tactics. Those towering engines rolling forward with flags snapping in the wind were the original shock and awe. They were not just about breaching walls, but about breaking a city's spirit. Their legacy remains etched into ruins. The Roman siege ramps at Masada, the layered walls of Constantinople that withstood countless machines until cannons, finally, brought them down, and Europe's castles with their round towers and angled bastions, each telling the story of constant adaptation to survive the war machines of men. Siege warfare was brutal, relentless, and ingenious. It was the story of mankind's enduring struggle between fortification and force, defense and destruction. And in the dance of engines and walls, of rock and fire, of mines and metal, the future of war was forged.